9 1-800.
We live in an age where the chance of
sounds incredibly complex. It sounds like students, you need to have abilities that span. I'm really geeking out here. I'm curious about one of the other humanitarian crises or events that you've been involved with or helped model. Is it a tsunami? Is it earthquakes? Is it all of the above? Or I'd love to hear more about a specific example that kind of also led into the work that you do now.
Yeah, so maybe because we live in the southeastern part of the United States, and this is one of those areas, it's not if we will have a hurricane, but when and where we might have a hurricane and the impact. Some of our work focused quite a bit on hurricanes, not so much on predicting the path of the hurricane, so that's our civil and environmental engineering and other colleagues do a fantastic job there. But we focus more on preparedness and also response. So let me talk a little bit about each. So let me first kind of go to the response side. So when a natural disaster happens, whether it's a hurricane or an earthquake, typically there is a lot of debris on the ground. This could be tree debris, buildings. Depending on the type of disaster, you might see different types of debris. This topic may not sound that exciting, but it has a huge impact on response and recovery efforts. So when there is debris on the ground, you cannot reach people for search and rescue operations. It becomes very difficult for people to evacuate the area. It becomes very difficult for us to bring in supplies and personnel to help. It becomes difficult to restore the infrastructure. For example, if you have a power outage, you can only go and fix the outage in a particular area if you can actually access that area. So that is one of the things, and as an example that we focused on, if we have an area that some of the roads are at least partially blocked by debris, what is a good plan to clear the debris so that we can actually restore life to normal or deliver goods and services or get people out in the most efficient and effective manner. So that's one of the areas that we have done quite a bit of work on. Another area which is more on the preparedness side is on inventory prepositioning. We have done several projects there. As one example, I'll talk about a project that we have done with CARE. Again, as some of our listeners might know, is a large nonprofit organization. It's headquartered in Atlanta, but they do most of their work in other countries. They operate in over 90 countries right now, if I'm not mistaken. And they respond to disasters as well as doing some work in the development space. So when we first engaged with them, and this was true for many of the other nonprofit organizations, their procurement for disaster response would happen for the most part after a disaster. So something happens, and then they see the need, and then funding donations start to come in, and then they would go do procurement and then try to deliver the supplies. So of course, as you can imagine, this creates issues in so many different ways. Timing is a huge concern. By the time you are able to negotiate the contracts, do the procurement, and then actually deliver the goods there, the clock is ticking. The first 24 to 72 hours after a disaster are crucial in terms of saving lives and either helping people or getting them out. And this approach would make it very difficult in terms of timely response. And from an economic perspective also, it poses challenges because after a disaster, a lot of organizations are going after the same suppliers, same transportation providers. So sometimes you would see that the cost of a good would go up 3, 4, 5 times the normal, the normal price. So we looked at pre-positioning supplies for disaster response, considering different scenarios and looking at historical data of what happens in certain regions. We basically looked at worldwide, where would we pre-position these supplies, which supplies in what quantities, and then we looked at the trade-offs of pre-positioning versus shipping after the fact, both on timeliness and cost. So those are some of the projects that we had done over the years on the disaster space, both in the preparedness side and also on the response side.
And as you were talking again, I don't think I'll make too much of a political statement here, but this idea that and it's often difficult for decision makers to do that advanced planning because to spend money, to spend resources now for something in many cases are going to happen. In this case, it was something like people had really hoped was never going to happen. I guess my question, so I understand that, and it's really fascinating that pre-positioning and doing all this stuff ahead. It's probably just a pretty simple question. How much does it save by doing that kind of pre-positioning? I mean, are we talking about, it's obviously a huge savings in time, but even just dollar amounts, a dollar that I invest now today saves $2, $10, $100. What's a typical kind of a thing?
Significantly, I think all of the numbers you put in, depending on the scenario, could be realized. For every dollar we invest, we save $3, $5, $7, or even $10, right? So depending on the scenario, I think sometimes the difficulty is that you invest in prevention, and then because of the investment you made, you don't see a huge, impact. And then some people might come and question, why did we spend all that money? Nothing happened, right? So I think that's the hard part to quantify with prevention. So that's one piece. The other piece is that when there's a disaster, it's easier to motivate people, policymakers, to spend the funds to stop it or to mitigate the negative impact. But before that happens, it's not that easy to make the case. So they might think, oh, maybe they're just crying wolf. There is really no danger here. Let's wait and see if something actually is going to happen. I mean, I think an excellent example is evacuation, right? So how do you make a hurricane evacuation decision? Because if you evacuate people and then eventually maybe the event is not as big as you predicted, you are under fire. Why did you evacuate people? What a waste of time and money. If you don't evacuate them and then something really big happens, now you actually may have cost lives. So these are very difficult decisions because we are making them under huge uncertainty, and we need to weigh the pros and cons of doing something versus not doing something. And again, if all goes well, you might be criticized for, why did you do this and waste money? But the cost of not doing it might sometimes be much, 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 much higher.
And as an outsider, or dare I say taxpayer, that's why those models are so important, right? That the more accurate, the more detailed, the more specific that those models can be, and the more complex they can be, I don't say the easier those decisions are, but the more informed those decisions are.
Right, right.